Oh, I'm Dr. Mike Gabriel. I'm chair of the history department at Kutztown University. David Pitlick asked me if I could give a talk up at the Bennington battlefield, but it's hard for me to get up there with this time of year with the weather and everything else going on. So what we decided to do is to use some high technology to give a little bit of a different presentation. So to talk about the Battle of Bennington, probably it would be better if it looked more like what it was that hot August in 1777. That's better. Phew. All right. The other thing I want to do here is share my screen with you so you can actually understand the talk a little better. Second here. Perfect. So the name of my talk is The Sound of Silence, Investigating an Acoustic Shadow at the Battle of Bennington, 1777. Just to give a little background, you're all familiar with the Battle of Bennington, but in August 1777, General John Burgoyne sends Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich Baum to the Bennington area to gather supplies, horses, and enlist loyalists. Very quickly, he runs into problems. He encounters far many more soldiers than what he anticipates, American militia, and a second force led by Colonel Heinrich Bremen is sent to his aid. Bremen travels very slow and doesn't arrive until after Baum has been annihilated by John Stark's army of New York, Vermont, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire militia, also some Green Mountain Boys. So ever since that day in 1777, there's been a question, what took Bremen so long? And what we're going to look at today is what we're going to call The Sound of Silence, Investigating an Acoustic Shadow at the Battle of Bennington. Get us started here. Bremen himself. I must positively declare that neither during the march nor even after I reached the mill did I hear a single shot fired, either from small arms or cannons. Ever since that day, once again, people have wondered what happened. Why did Bremen take so long? John Burgoyne, who initially sent the Bennington expedition, issued a public statement after it saying Bremen had been delayed by bad weather, bad roads, tired horses, and other impediments. Maybe so, but that didn't answer all the critics. Historians and even people at the time speculated that perhaps Bremen purposely dragged his feet. They noted it took him 32 hours to cover 24 miles. And possibly the reason for this is he and Baum disliked each other. They had personal animosity. The origins of this are a little bit unclear, somewhat debated, but possibly Bremen purposely took his time so Baum would be in a much more difficult situation. Adding to this supposition is a rumor that was written in the diary of a British soldier. Supposedly, while on the march, Bremen said, quote, "We will let them get warm before we reach them," when he heard the firing from Stark's attack on Baum take place. A matter of fact, Bremen's own statement, "I must positively declare that I neither during the march nor even after I reached the mill, I did not hear a single shot fired," seems to be included in that report as a refutation of what that rumor was, what that British soldier was saying. What I'm going to argue, and to some degree it's what Bremen is saying, is that Bremen did not hear the firing at the first phase of the Battle of Bennington because of what's called an acoustic shadow. So what exactly is an acoustic shadow? An acoustic shadow is somewhat of a catch-all term. Brief definition is an acoustic shadow is a zone of silence caused by unusual atmospheric conditions and other factors that prevent the normal transmission of sound waves. As a result, those near an event, such as a battle, cannot hear it, while others farther away or in a different direction can. There are many cases of acoustic shadows in history that have been recorded. Probably the first one might be 1480 when the Ottoman Turks attacked the island of Rhodes. In 1666, there's a naval battle called the 4-Day Battle in the English Channel. Definitely an acoustic shadow. People can't hear it. This phenomenon of acoustic shadows is very common in the Civil War. Many Civil War battles see this. Fort Donelson in February 1862, Perryville, October 1862, Chancellorsville, May 1863, Gettysburg, July 1863, and on I could go. Interestingly, every one of these Civil War engagements included many thousands more soldiers than fought at Bennington, many, many more cannons than fought at Bennington, yet officers just several miles away could not hear the firing. So it could happen at Bennington. The person who's really looked at acoustic shadows in a historic setting, mainly regarding the Civil War, is a Dr. Charles D. Ross, a physics professor at Longwood University. And Dr. Ross has identified a number of causes of acoustic shadows. The first is what's called absorption. And absorption is caused by topography and or foliage. The sound waves literally are absorbed and there's a void, okay? In terms of topography, one of the things that would cause an acoustic shadow are mountains. If we would look at our map here, Bryman leaves the Fort Miller area on August 15th, and he heads generally southeast. Around Cambridge, he turns due south, and when he gets to the area of the Walloomsic River, he turns directly east, or almost directly east, and he follows the winding Walloomsic Valley. If we would look at this map, if I could blow this map up, you could see to Bryman's left are these large towering mountains, anywhere from 800 to 1,000 feet tall, while on the other side we have the meandering Walloomsic. These mountains very easily could have contributed to an acoustic shadow by diverting or absorbing the sound waves, all right? If we would look at pictures of the battlefield and the terrain, you could see the mountains and the foliage, all right? This photo in particular is looking west from the battlefield towards the direction Bryman would have approached. And once again, you can see the high mountains. These illustrations also show us foliage, all right? Foliage, tree leaves would definitely help absorb sound waves. This is summertime, and there are these large primeval forests just filled with trees. So there would be very, very heavy foliage. We can not only see it in these illustrations, we can also see this on the Durnford map. Durnford map drawn by this British engineer who's at the Battle of Bennington. You can see the mountains, you can see forests, you can see broken fields for agriculture. But in addition to these illustrations, we also have firsthand accounts. One of the best firsthand accounts talk about the foliage and the topography is Julius Wasmus. Many of you will know Wasmus was a Braunschweig or Brunswick surgeon who participates in the Balm expedition. He'll be captured. We'll talk about that. And this is what he wrote on August 12th. He said, "We set out at 6 o'clock in the morning and marched up a mountain on our left and into the woods." Mountain and woods. On August 16th, Wasmus recorded that both the enemy and the Native Americans hid behind trees before and during the battles, while the Tories and a few Englishmen had to lay out a small entrenchment with big trees at our left wing. At the height of the attack on the so-called Dragoon Redoubt atop the so-called Hessian Hill, Wasmus took refuge behind a very big oak tree to treat wounded soldiers. So Wasmus records many examples of foliage and trees, okay, on the Bennington battlefield. The same is true for American soldiers. American militiamen John Austin and Silas Walbridge recounted, quote, marching round through the woods, close quote, into Baum's rear. and then, quote, firing from behind logs and trees, etc. Lieutenant John Orr recalled, quote, passed through the woods and cornfield to attack the Loyalist redoubt on the far side of the Willamsick River. So once again, topography and foliage would cause absorption. Another cause of acoustic shadows that Dr. Ross has identified is what's called refraction. Refraction is the bending of sound waves caused by differences in air temperatures and or wind shears. High temperatures and humidity can also lead to refraction. So if we would look in this image here, because of the combination of cool and warm air, the sound is bouncing. You have an audible area followed by a shadow of no sound, followed by audible, shadow, audible, and on and on. It can happen repeatedly, which we will mention later. So once again, refraction is partly caused by high temperatures and humidity. What evidence do we have that this was the case at the time of the Battle of Bennington? Well, once again, we have a lot of firsthand accounts that tell us this. On August 11th, a British soldier with Burgoyne recorded a violent thunderstorm with heavy winds and rain that drove the men from their tents. Okay, the men flee their tents because they're being blown over. Beyond this man writes that the storm so frightened the army's horses that, quote, they tore down the small sheds formed to keep the heat and sun off of them. The horses are so afraid by the storm, they kick down these sheds. Now, this is an interesting quote because it tells us a couple things. We've all experienced these very severe thunderstorms in the summertime, mid-afternoon when it's hot and humid. Once again, this is what we're describing here. What's interesting is the British soldiers are concerned enough about the sun on their horses that they build sheds for the horses, and the horses destroy these. This must have been a very, very violent thunderstorm. We have other examples of this. On August 14th, a soldier described the, quote, cruel heat that caused heavy straggling among Burgoyne's Germans as they, end quote, they were in danger of suffocating on the march. These poor soldiers are just suffering because of the high heat and humidity. August 15, 2 days before the battle, or the day before the Battle of Bennington, there's heavy rain that not only slowed Bryman's march, but it also postponed Stark's attack on Baum until the following afternoon. August 16th, the day of the battle, that's the one that really counts. How do we know there was high heat and humidity at Bennington? Once again, the soldiers' accounts. Amantha Ives and others recall the blistering heat of the day. They talked about how hot it was, how thirsty they became. Now, part of this is adrenaline. It's the heat of combat. It's the activity, but it was also certainly the atmospheric conditions. And these continued. Interestingly, on August 17th, the day after the battle, as Bryman's men are making their way back into Burgoyne's camp, they're described as, quote, quite exhausted by the fighting, the heat of the day, and the forced marches. This devastating heat and humidity continued for the next several weeks at least, and some British soldiers claimed that what they experienced in upstate New York was worse than conditions in India. That's quite a statement. So, once again, we seem to have all the ingredients of an acoustic shadow: topography, foliage to absorb, and refraction caused by high temperatures and humidities. This all somewhat begs the question then, was the battle loud enough to be heard? And undoubtedly the answer is yes. First off, we have just raw numbers. Stark has approximately 2,000 soldiers, give or take a little bit, and Baum, depending on how many loyalists are there, what accounts you want to believe, is somewhere around 700-800, maybe a little bit more. But the point here is that this opening phase of the battle, which begins about 3:00 p.m., there's 3,000 soldiers potentially firing muskets. In addition to this, Baum has 2 3-pounder cannons, and his dragoons fired by volleys, which would create large crashes of musketries. Beyond the evidence of the numbers, once again, we have accounts. John Stark, the American commander, a veteran of the French and Indian War, the Battle of Bunker Hill, the battles of Trenton and Princeton. John Stark calls Bennington, quote, the hottest engagement I ever witnessed, resembling a continual clap of thunder. Now, maybe Stark is pumping this up because it's his battle, but to say it's a continual clap of thunder and it's the hottest engagement, more so than Bunker Hill, that is quite a statement. All right. Levi Beardsley, a New York State senator, will recall what his father told him about the battle. Levi Beardsley's grandfather owned a farm and a house right on the edge of the Bennington battlefield near the bridge, and his father was about 13 or 14 at the time of the battle. And this is what Beardsley recalled. He said, my father, who was very near the scene of action, could hear every gun, used to compare the incessant reports with the constant snapping of hemlock brush when exposed to fire. In the midst of the din of small arms, the field pieces were admirably served and kept booming away at the advancing Americans. In addition to these accounts, we have Jacob and Solomon Safford. You can see all these people on my map here. Solomon Safford remained in Bennington guarding the American camps, but he recalled hearing heavy fighting, at least for a short period of time. Jacob Safford, a Green Mountain boy with Seth Warner, marches from Bennington towards the battlefield while the first battle is going on. And Jacob recorded once they were 2 or 3 miles from the battlefield, they could begin to hear the firing. The firing became louder as they got closer, not surprisingly, and they began to see wounded soldiers making their way to the rear. Another person who records the sound of the battle is a New York militia ranger named Levi Skinner. Now, Levi Skinner's exact location is a little bit hard to determine. He moves in different places. He also says the enemy were between our company and the Americans, so that could put him in a number of different places. But Skinner recalls that he could hear firing, quote, part of the time, my emphasis, part of the time. Is that because he's moving, or is that because the sound waves are being refracted? Okay, we don't know. But when put with these other examples of evidence of an acoustic shadow, Skinner seems to hear this. In addition to these people who are immediately near the battlefield, we have several other accounts of people who heard the fighting. Many years later, Sarah McCoy McNish of Salem, New York, about 18 miles north of the battlefield, recalled her father standing on a stump and hearing the sounds of cannon. McNish would have been about 22 at the time she recalls this. Similarly, there are accounts that people in Williamstown, Massachusetts, about 18 miles to the south, also could hear the cannon reports from the Battle of Bennington. So once again, we have north and south and east, all right? But the most interesting one, and the one that seems to really give us some evidence of acoustic shadows and probably refraction, is a New Hampshire loyalist by the name of Abner Sanger. Abner Sanger lived in Charlestown, New Hampshire, about 60 miles northeast from Bennington. Sanger and several other men were harvesting wheat on the afternoon of August 16th, and this is what Sanger recorded in his diary. He said, fair and warm, cannons are heard all the afternoon towards the westward. What are those cannons? Well, it's probably the Battle of Bennington, and he's hearing this because of refraction. Interestingly, and if we would look at the left side of our map here, none of the soldiers, German or British, who recorded diaries in Burgoyne's camp recorded hearing the Battle of Bennington. Didn't seem to travel in that direction. And once again, Bryman himself denied hearing any firing. So it seems that not everybody heard the sound, and those who did were only in specific locations. Question comes up, which part of the Battle of Bennington did these various people hear? Because there are two phases. There's the Baum phase and there's the Bryman phase, which you all know. The only one that seems to definitively have included the Baum phase would be, once again, that loyalist, okay, Abner Sanger. And the way we know this is what Sanger wrote. He said cannons were heard throughout the afternoon. It was over an extended period of time. So he probably heard both phases of the battle, but certainly the Baum phase. This idea of sound waves bouncing from one place to another, refraction, isn't uncommon. And it happens very often during the American Civil War, at least often enough in the Civil War. The best example is at the Battle of Gaines Mills in June 1862. Gaines Mill is fought near Richmond, but is heard 140 miles away. Once again, because of refraction and bouncing sound waves, probably the same thing is happening here, and that's why it's heard in Charlestown, New Hampshire. Another question that comes up, and we can see it here on my map, is who hears the battle and where are they? Well, once again, we have Stark, we have Beardsley's father, we have the Safford brothers, we have Sarah McNish, we have Abner Sanger. What's interesting is if we look at these, they all tend to be east of the battlefield or farther north or south, or in one case, very farther east. All right. Interestingly, though, Ryman approaches the battlefield from the west. Once again, it seems he doesn't hear it. And this phenomenon of people to the east hearing sound and maybe not people in the west is also seen throughout the afternoon, most notably when Bryman actually arrives, when the second phase of the battle begins. Kind of interestingly, as the first phase of the American battle ends, or the Baum phase of the battle ends, American soldiers such as Jesse Fields and others are searching the area for prisoners, they're tending to wounded, or they're searching for loot. And these are the people who encounter Bryman as they're chasing down Baum survivors. They run into Bryman, and Bryman opens fire on them. The other Americans who are back towards the battlefield, the part one battlefield, they hear this firing, and that causes them to fall into line and then move towards Bryman. Interestingly, maybe the best evidence of this comes from, once again, Julius Wasmuth. Wasmuth, the captured surgeon. This is what Wasmuth writes. He says, "It was 5 o'clock when we heard cannons and volley firing in the direction of Sandcoik. This was the Bryman Corps that had been designated for our aid, but unfortunately had now arrived too late. All the enemy ran there from the battlefield, and all the prisoners who had assembled here at the bridge were quickly led away. So once again, the sound waves have traveled to the east, and people at the battlefield hear Bryman. Once again, we don't know if Bryman heard the battle. And as a matter of fact, we're arguing no, he didn't. So what evidence do we have Heinrich Bryman did not hear the fighting from the first phase of the battle? Well, we have 4 eyewitnesses, and together they give us some evidence. The first one is Bryman himself. We already saw his opening quote. "I must positively declare I did not hear a single shot fired." All right. But we have other evidence, once again, from that same statement. As Bryman is approaching the Bennington battlefield, as he's marching east, at about 2:00 p.m. on August 16th, Bryman received a message from Philip Skeen. We're going to get to Skeen in a few minutes, asking him to send 20 soldiers to the Sandcoik Mill. Baum had left a small detachment of loyalists there, and for whatever reason, Skeen now believes he needs troops to secure that position. Maybe it's because he's seen those flanking columns. Maybe he's seen Samuel Herrick's columns circling into the rear of Baum's command. We don't know what the reason is, but he asks for troops, and instead of 20, Bryman actually sends him 80. All right. Now, this is where, once again, our quotes begin again. Bryman sends those troops forward, and about an hour and a half later, around 4:30 p.m., he himself arrives at the Sandquoit Mill. And this is what he says. He says, I found the advance guard in possession of it, the mill, and all quiet. Once again, the emphasis is added. There are no sounds of gunfire. If there are, maybe he moves forward, but there aren't any. All right. That leads us to eyewitness number 2, Philip Skene. Philip Skene, once again, is a former British officer. He's the founder of Skenesboro, and he had joined Burgoyne's army when it moved into north central New York in the summer of 1777. And Burgoyne attached Skene to Baum's command to help recruit loyalists, issue loyalty oaths, also buy provisions, buy wagons, horses, etc. On the morning of the Battle of Bennington, Baum sent Philip Skene back to the mills at Sandquoit, where he had left this loyalist detachment to mill the wheat. And he was also supposed to hurry Bryman up. Bryman was known to be on the way, and Skene was supposed to encourage him to hurry. Now, 2 weeks after the Battle of Bennington, Philip Skene wrote a letter to the Earl of Dartmouth, and this is what Skene describes. He says, about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Major Berner pressed forward to the mills at Sandquoit with the light troops. Those were the ones Skene himself had requested. And listen to this. And then he says, and they intended to march on until I begged he would be cool and wait for the detachment. He accordingly halted, and Lieutenant Colonel Brymer came up. Interestingly, Skene sees these 80 light troops show up under Major Berner, and instead of immediately sending them forward to rescue Baum, he tells them to wait at least a half an hour, it turns out, until Bryman himself shows up. Why did Skene do this? Well, presumably he doesn't know that Baum has been attacked and is being destroyed. He doesn't hear the firing. If he does, presumably he tries to hurry Bryman up even more, and maybe he even sends those 80 light soldiers forward. And we continue on, okay? A little bit more of what Skene says. And about this point, Skene continues, at about this time, a volunteer of the provincials came in and said that Lieutenant Baum's party was cut off. I own I wanted faith to believe him, especially when Captain Campbell arrived and said he believed things were not so bad, that he with a party of Indians was ordered to attack the rebels in their rear, but having gotten between 2 forces, he got off with the Indians he had with him. Very interesting, okay? So once again, at about the time Bryman is showing up and the light troops are showing up, a volunteer of provincials, a loyalist, shows up at the Sandquoit Mills and tells Skene that Baum is in trouble. And interestingly, Skene does not believe him, okay? Presumably he hears the fire and this guy comes back, he would say something, but Skene doesn't believe him. And then to add to that, a Captain Campbell, who we're going to get to in a few minutes, arrives, and he says Baum is not in a particularly bad situation. And as a matter of fact, Campbell has been ordered to attack the Americans on their flank with the Indians, and he intended to do so, but he got caught between 2 different American forces, so he was forced to fall back. But once again, there is no evidence that anybody here seems particularly worried about Baum except the volunteer of provincials, and nobody seems to believe him. All right. If they had heard heavy firing coming from the first phase of the battle, the continual clap of thunder, as John Stark describes it, presumably they would move on and try to save Baum. But this doesn't happen. All right. Well, after briefly talking with Bryman and Skene, they set out and Bryman has 6 men deployed ahead of him. You would think if they knew heavy fighting was going on, they would deploy more than 6 people. They would put out a skirmish line. They would do something, but they don't. All right. And Skeen continues. He says, "We marched about 1,000 yards. I saw the rebels at the end of the worm fence. I was in doubt whether they were rebels or loyalists. To be certain, I galloped up to them at a distance of 100 yards and desired them to halt. Some did. I then asked them if they were for the king, or if they were for King George. They immediately presented and fired confusedly. Hit my horse, but missed me." Right? Kind of a funny quote, very famous quote. Okay. So they march 1,000 yards and they see armed men in front of them. Once again, if they know there's heavy fighting, if they hear fighting, presumably they anticipate these are the enemy, they deploy, but they don't. Instead, Skeen rides up and shouts out, "Are you for King George?" And they answer him with a volley that kills his horse. That's not what somebody does who's expecting combat. And once again, in all these cases, it seems that neither Skeen nor Bryman have heard the firing from the first phase of the battle. Why? Possibly because of an acoustic shadow. Terrain, foliage, refraction. All right. But we have a third witness. And this third witness is none other than Captain Colin Campbell, who we saw Skeen mention. Campbell is a British officer attached to the Native Americans. He's leading the Native Americans. And a year after the Battle of Bennington, Skeen provides his own account of what happened in a letter, or Campbell provides his own letter account of what happened in a letter he writes to Philip Skeen. And it's interesting, right off the bat, we see Campbell claims that he met Bryman 1.5 miles west of Sandcoik, not at the Sandcoik Mills, but west of the Sandcoik Mill, while Bryman is still on the march. If this is true, this would put it somewhere around 3 o'clock, right when the time of the battle would be taking place, the continual clap of thunder. And listen what Campbell says, kind of an important quote. He said, "In as good a French as I was master of, I said that Colonel Baum was attacked. I advised the officer who rid at the head of the advance guard to order his men to lay down their knapsacks, and that he would not have any distance to march before he would meet with the rebels. This was the conversation that passed before we came to Ransler's Mill, when we fell in with you, Skeen. You, Skeen, desired the party might halt and get some drink for a little time, saying the men looked jaded and fatigued." Campbell's story is a very, very interesting one, and it brings up a lot of different questions. First off, when he meets Bryman and the officer in charge of the advance guard, they cannot communicate directly. Campbell says, "I spoke in French, as good a French I was a master of." Well, that begs the question, how good was Campbell at French? Also begs the question, how good at French were Bryman and the officer in charge of the advance guard? There's a big communication issue here. Other historians have written about multinational forces, and they've noted the multiple languages being spoken in both Baum and Bryman's commands and the problems this might cause. This seems to be a case of this. What's significant is Campbell didn't invoke the actual sound of battle that they would hear. And neither Bryman or the officer of the advance guard seemed particularly concerned. Why? Because probably they can't hear the firing. And this continues once they get to Ransler's or Sandcoik Mill. Once again, look at what Skeen does. Skeen says, "The men look jaded and fatigued. Let's give them time to rest and get something to drink." Certainly not the actions of people who hear fighting and are expecting combat and have to rush forward to save Baum's command. It sure does seem at many levels they don't hear this, probably because of an acoustic shadow. There's another eyewitness. Eyewitness number 4 is an American loyalist named Peter Rosenbarica. Peter Rosenbarica is at the Sandcoik Mill and has been there since August 14th. Rosenbarica was one of the loyalists who set out with Baum, and as Baum passed through this mill on the way to what's going to become the Bennington battlefield, he left behind a loyalist detachment to secure the mill, secure his line of march, but also to begin milling all this grain that they found there. And Rosenbarica is one of them. And Rosenbarica talks about the end of the battle, that what happened on the afternoon or early evening of August 16th. And listen what he says. He said, I remained at said mill until after the Bennington battle. Then, hearing of the defeat and finding the army retreating back, your memorialist, in company with Captain John Reuter, immediately repaired through the woods to Hoosick, aforesaid, to his family. Rosenbarica is interesting, okay? Notice he says he heard of the defeat. He didn't say he heard the defeat. He heard of the defeat. Somebody told him. He didn't say I could hear the sound of the fighting. I could see stragglers coming back. He says, I heard of the defeat, which begs the question, who told him? Somebody told him. He didn't know about it. Somebody had to tell him Baum had been annihilated, and possibly Bryman too. Who was that person? Well, I don't know, but my speculation is it's Captain John Reuter. All right. We remember Skeen said a volunteer, a provincial volunteer, had come in and said Baum was in trouble. And Skeen said he didn't believe him. Who was that person? Well, it was probably Captain John Reuter. Skeen might not have believed in an American loyalist, but Peter Rosenbarica, another American loyalist, probably would believe a neighbor, Reuter. They're both from Hoosick. And it's interesting, the two men leave and they go through the woods, once again, the woods, to escape. All right. They go back to their families. So we have 4 different eyewitness accounts of people who are at the mill at Sandcoik, and none of them record hearing the sound of battle. None of them seemingly do anything to suggest that they know that Baum is in trouble. Why? Because of an acoustic shadow. There is one last piece of evidence. There are one other set of witnesses, and those witnesses are the 664 officers and men, enlisted men, who composed Bryman's relief column. As they march towards the battle, they encounter others such as Campbell, Skeen, and Peter Rosenbarica, and others who are at the Sandcoik Mill. Presumably, if Bryman heard the firing and then said, we're going to let them get warm, some other people would have recorded that. Now, we know at least one person did, a British soldier, but that British soldier recorded it in his diary, and he wasn't at the Battle of Bennington. He heard it as a rumor. So there was whisperings of this, but it certainly wasn't widespread, at least not widespread enough to provoke some kind of internal investigation. If Bryman purposely dragged his feet and allowed Baum Command to be destroyed, at some point you would think evidence of that would surface, an investigation would have taken place, but that does not happen. How do we know? Well, we have to look at some commanders. John Burgoyne, all right, issued a public finding on what happened. And as I said earlier in the talk, he said it was tired horses, rain, and other impediments. Very interestingly, Burgoyne wrote a private letter to the British government describing what happened at Bennington. And in that letter, he complains about Baum and Bryman. He said Baum failed to follow instructions. He got himself into a situation that led to disaster. He complained Bryman moved far too slow, but never once did he question his professional ethics or his professional conduct as a German officer. Presumably, maybe he would. Now, maybe he wouldn't because it was just Germans who were destroyed, but they were still part of his command. Interestingly, Major General Friedrich Radesow, who commanded the German troops, never seemed to question Bryman. There seemed to have been no condemnation of Bryman for what happened. And in fact, Bryman was left in command of his force, and he would serve through both battles of Saratoga. He's actually killed on October 7th at the Second Battle of Saratoga, the so-called Battle of Venus Heights. All right. So if he had purposely dragged his feet, presumably he would not have been allowed to stay in command, but he didn't, which suggests the upper command could find no definitive proof this had happened, and they believed him, at least believed him enough that there was an acoustic shadow. He did not hear the firing. So let's kind of conclude here. Let's summarize. What do we know? Well, we do know that on August 16th, 1777, the conditions for an acoustic shadow do exist. We know there were mountains, topography, which could cause absorption. We know there was heavy foliage on the trees, which also could cause the absorption of sound waves. We also know there was high heat and humidity, which could lead to refraction. And if we believe Abner Sanger, we know refraction occurred because the firing was heard 60 miles away. Additionally, we have the first-hand testimony of 4 witnesses who were at the mills of St. Coig. One, a German officer, Bryman, specifically said, "I did not hear a sound." A second, a former British officer, Philip Skene, another current British officer, Colin Campbell, and then an American loyalist, Peter Rosenbarica, all talked about the battle, but none of them mentioned hearing the battle and did nothing to suggest they heard firing and therefore rushed to Baum's aid. This leads me to conclude that probably there was an acoustic shadow. There was a sound of silence. And this sound of silence along the banks of the Walloomsic River had far-reaching consequences that opened the door to the American winning their independence. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this presentation and you learned something. Thank you again.